Welcome to this week's Live with Littlewood in front of a live audience here in our Westminster studios, where we take a free market and classical liberal look at all of the issues facing Britain and the world. And we've got a lot to get through tonight. Is it time to clean up Parliament's culture of misogyny? Labour, well, they've been calling for a windfall tax on oil and gas companies because of their bumper profits. Does that mean in leaner years, Labour would be offering these companies a rebate of some sort? And while we're worried in the context of the local elections about waste collection, potholes, all of those sort of local issues, is it really the waste of local councils and their spending that we should be focused on? I've got, as usual, a stellar lineup of guests to help guide us through these topics and many more on this week's Live with Littlewood. Boom shakalaka, kaboom kapow. Welcome to this week's Live with Littlewood. With me, Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. We've got a ton to get through in this evening's show. Later on, I'm going to be joined by Morgan Schondelmeier from our good friends round the corner at the Adam Smith Institute. I'm going to be asking her whether a human resources strategy is really the best way of dealing with Pestminster and misogyny. I'll also be joined by my good friend John O'Connell, Chief Executive over at the Taxpayers Alliance. Looking forward to the local elections that are happening in the UK this week and teasing out whether local government is really efficient or effective at anything at all. And from the IEA home team, I'll be joined by our Head of Lifestyle Economics, Chris Snowdon. He'll be discussing sin taxes and windfall taxes. Do they have any redeeming features at all? But first up, delighted to be joined by a very good friend, writer, political commentator, pundit, all-round good guy, champion of freedom. Please give a very warm welcome to Alex Deane.
Thank you very much.
Great to see you, Alex.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I thought we'd kick off, Alex, by having us two white cis males talking about the political culture in Westminster. Seems like we're about the right people to do it. It's immersed again in one of these sort of scandals. We've seen one MP quit his seat, two MPs quit their seats. We're going to have by-elections in both, and this has prompted a suggestion that the culture of politics in this square mile or so is misogynistic, sleazy, heavy drinking. I don't know where they get those ideas from at all. Is there a problem in the culture of politics? You've been a Westminster watcher in detail for many years. What do you make of the culture here in this postcode area of SW1?
I take the Jess Phillips position, which is that blaming something on a culture is the easy answer. And the actual answer is that it's not a culture of misogyny. There are some misogynists. It's not a culture of alcoholism. There are some alcoholics. And responsibility in the end lies with individuals. Plenty of people go into public life most people go into public life wanting to do good, not doing anything wrong, and emerge at the end of their time in Westminster, if not greatly impoverished, not a great deal better off. And they could have been, rewarded in the city and so forth. They go in and emerge, quite often married to the same person. They don't do anything that people are being accused of. And the vast majority of people in Westminster, it's a very unfashionable answer, but the vast majority of people in Westminster are decent sorts, trying to do their best in hard circs.
But it's I've been reflecting on it. It's a weird environment in the Westminster Village, isn't it? Because it's kind of high octane. You feel, perhaps wrongly, but nevertheless you sort of feel you're at the centre of everything. You walk around the streets where we are here, you'll bump into cabinet ministers, MPs, senior journalists, people who would really sort of stand out if they weren't actually in their area of business. It's quite edgy. There's lots of plotting. There's lots of Machiavellianism going on. There's lots of backstabbing going on. Is it time for a softer, gentler politics, or does that just make public debate anemic?
What you've just described in the atmosphere of Westminster, which, by the way, is entirely accurate in the way that you've described it, has been true of all democratic forums. You know, I'm sure the Romans had much the same sort of complaints, mutatis mutandis, about things that were happening in their Senate and in their environments. There's a bit less killing of one another in Westminster, but nevertheless, the basic comparison stands. If you have a number of alpha-type people, men and women, crashing around one another, very ambitious, you are likely to have ferocity and you're likely to have intrigue, especially in an environment that thrives on oppositional politics. And again, unfashionably, I believe in oppositional politics. I think the best way to test an idea is for someone to advocate it as best they can and crash it into, as hard as you can, someone else advocating the alternative point of view.
And do you think that sort of, I mean, is there you've sort of stood up for the bulk of politicians and public servants, you know, there are a few bad apples. But might it be the case, I mean, look, we're supposed to be talking about economics, not psychology, but might it be the case that elected politics attracts more than its fair share of bad apples? I mean, I don't want to besmirch the characters of all 650 MPs. Well, actually, I probably do. But might it be the case that these people are, you said alpha, but, you know, unbelievably ambitious, perhaps more prone to narcissism, more power hungry, determined to get on and willing to crawl over the broken bodies of those they have slain to get to the top of the greasy pole? Might it be that politics just doesn't attract, you know, ordinary decent people in the way that other careers might, or that at least they're more likely to be some of these character flaws?
No. People who have those flaws and exhibit them are more newsworthy than those who don't. And I think, broadly speaking, you're as likely to find people at the apex of business and at the apex of the arts, let's say Hollywood, with as many of the flaws that you're describing, if not more, than those that you find in Westminster. Now, you might say, well, they're all sociopathic pursuits. They're all people who basically have something wrong with them. But no, I don't think in any way it's unique to politics. And by the way, I don't think it's unique to Westminster either in the modern age. I think if you go to many parliaments around the world, you find much the same criticism. I may say one more thing. I think that when people seize on these examples and choose to make of them a case from the individual about the general, you do a great disservice to democracy, because actually it's corrosive of public belief and trust in public life, because actually it's not all like that. But if you take the easy and cynical way and saying they're all at it, it's a den of iniquity, then, for example, we've got local elections coming up, why would I bother voting? If they're all at it and they're all the same, why would I do it? And indeed, at the local level, people are even more blameless. You know, people are contributing as best they can to their local communities. And the suggestion that everyone's got their snout in the trough on the one hand, or is behaving appallingly on the other, I think is wrong both at local and national level. And
you might take the view that, although, I mean, to the extreme personal and professional embarrassment of a couple of MPs, you know, plastered all over the newspapers for their misdemeanours, or in some cases worse than misdemeanours, the system seems to be pretty good at weeding them out. I mean, you know, it's as if we're sort of looking back and saying, well, these people have got away with it, and their careers are being terminated for misbehaviour.
Well, correct, and people don't walk away from these kinds of situations anymore to carry on in the way that perhaps once they might have done. But I would point out that one of the reasons you perhaps don't see this in, let's say, business so much, you know, I'm convinced there's every bit as much bad behaviour, if not worse, at the apex of major businesses and corporations. It's just that unless you get into, say, an employment tribunal, the businesses have an interest in not airing those things, whereas in Westminster there's an enormous and partisan interest in airing the problems of your opponents.
So, what do you think of some of the ideas that have been put forward? I think there are 3 suggested changes to the way Westminster might operate. Compulsory training for MPs on sexual harassment in the workplace, that's one of them. Oliver Dowden, the chairman of the Conservative Party, has insisted that half of Tory MPs returned following the next election must be women. I don't know how he's going to bring that about, because it's sort of more in the gift of the electorate than in his own personal gift, but would that help in some way? Should that be the sort of thing we're aiming for? And there's also a suggestion, I think this is very likely to happen, that MP staff should now be employed directly by Parliament or an outside body rather than each of the 650 MPs making their own employment decisions. What do you make of any or all of those suggestions? Will any of those make Parliament a better place to work?
I think the third one is almost guaranteed to happen, and would probably have a positive outcome, albeit people do still want to work with people that they are like and work with people that they like, and if in the end you want to work with someone that you admire or that you want to support, you're going to have to find a way of allowing that system to facilitate that. But that third one, I think, is very likely to come about, and probably about time too. That should be more professionalised. There is a fourth, by the way, which is lessening the pastoral role of the whips, because it's awkward to have people who are responsible for party discipline also being responsible for the kinds of complaints that we're talking about, and for the kind of there's also a pastoral responsibility over the people who've been accused of things.
Sure.
And it's awkward to have people holding both of those reins. So I think that fourth one's likely to happen too. On the other two that you mentioned, I'm very much against, on principle, tokenism, and I'm against quotas. And I think that the Conservative Party is a good example of people succeeding on merit. First female Prime Minister, you look at the Cabinet now, and then, by the way, the second female Prime Minister, look at the Cabinet now with Priti Patel, Rishi Sunak, Kwasi Kwarteng. You've got people of Sajid Javid, you've got people of diverse backgrounds all around you, and people talk about, well, who might be the next contenders. Penny Mordaunt's always named, Liz Truss is always named. All of the people I'm talking about got there without quotas. They got there on their abilities. And the trouble, as we saw with the so-called Blair babes in the late 90s, is that...
Pretty patronising term,
which is why I say so cool, is that the people who arrive with that label, the people who arrive with, regardless of their abilities, regardless of their qualities, if you arrive with the badge of I was selected under a system that would only let someone like me get ahead, people will always think that's why you're there, rather than because of your abilities. And I think that's corrosive, actually.
Well, it's going to be interesting. Let's take another take. We don't have any diversity quotas here at all at the IEA, but we'll see whether it's a similar or a different perspective. Please give a very warm welcome to our second guest of the evening from our very good friends at the Adam Smith Institute, their Director of Operations, Morgan Schondelmeier. Morgan, thanks for joining us. So, how much should we think of you as a victim? You're female, you're American, you drink white wine rather than beer. I mean, you've got quite a lot of problems. I mean, what do you make of the culture of Westminster? Because typically speaking, I guess part of the narrative is folk like Alex and I are part of the problem.
I'd have to agree with basically everything you just said about quotas, and this is something I experience, as you say, as a woman in Westminster. I'm the one who gets asked, can you come on this? And I say, no, how about my colleague? He's much more up to date on this. This is his policy. Ooh, but we were really just looking for a woman. That makes me feel great, It makes me feel really talented, really valued for what I can add. So having experienced that, someone who's been asked to do something not because of my skills, just because I'm a woman, it doesn't feel great. And I certainly wouldn't want that stigma following me around my entire career. So 100% agree with the idea that we should encourage women to stand. We should work on the problems we're talking about in Westminster to make it a more welcoming place for women. There's a lot of women my age who are leaving Parliament because they just don't feel like it's a good place for them to work or start their careers, which is something that will have effects down the line when you try to get women into Parliament as MPs. So you can absolutely target those things, but I don't think saying that we're going to have you run just because you're a woman is
and since
sort of
when
meaningful change.
has establishing a new HR department really been the silver bullet solution to any problem? I'm not against those sort of things. Alex was talking about pastoral care, but the worry must be that you get a lot of tick box rules rather than just a change in the culture, right?
Yeah, and I think the bigger issue is how Parliament is structured. Like we were talking about, MPs employ their staffers directly. You basically have 600 small businesses working under one, in one place. So you kind of can't really have these overarching structures because each MP gets to determine how they run their office themselves. And as you say, if we have a political body like the Whip's office in charge of maintaining standards, there's going to be that head-to-head with, protecting the party, protecting the image, with also making sure you're doing your duty by vulnerable people working in Parliament.
Alex, let me come back to you because, although there's a danger we're going to vociferously agree, so it's my job to try and bring in a bit of disagreement, play a bit of devil's advocate here. But I do, in principle, agree with both of you about quotas and the problems they bring. But if you were to look hypothetically, this isn't true of the Westminster Parliament at the moment, but imagine a scenario in which you looked at it and let's say there were 600 men and only 50 women. Would you say, well, that's the way the cards fall? I mean, women can put themselves up for election, 50 of them have made it. You know, more women can step forward if they want, but doesn't much matter if they don't. Or would those sort of numbers indicate that you might have a sexism problem, that it's kind of weird that there's, in my extraordinary scenario, 12 times as many men, but sort of, if it isn't around 50-50, might that be a signal that something's gone wrong, that the working environment is more conducive to one sex rather than the other, for example?
Possible, but I would, first of all, Parliament's not like that, right? So we are where we are, and the reality is that we've got many more...
But some might say that's because of things like women-only shortlists for the Labour Party.
On one side, and they didn't last in magnitude for all that long either, and they're not deployed in anything like the same volume that they were, and when they are, it's a bit controversial, even amongst the Labour Party. I was listening to what Morgan was saying. I've had a few producers over the years say to me about the media, Alex, we're after someone who thinks what you think. Will you someone who say exactly what you say, but as a woman, please? Have you got one of them? And I do think to myself, well, on the other hand, there are some guys who wind up on the wrong side of that equation, and one might say that's an unfair outcome. After all, there is more. Once you start dividing up the population into groups which have preferences which need to be catered for, or have been discriminated against, which have to be counted in formalised terms, there is no end to the way that you will divide up society. Like, for example, I went to a good university, I think, but I went to a state school. Now, I got there, I believe, on my own merits. If I got there on a quota, I don't think I'd ever got away from, and that's me as a man saying, I don't think I would ever have got away from the stigma of people thinking that was why you were there. And once you start doing that, and in the educational example it's more stark because it often means lowering grades in order to obtain that, then you never get away from that stigma. In the same way, the suggestion that you basically rig the competition to get into Parliament, or at least get to be the candidate by dint of sex, implies that you are not capable of taking on the contest in order to get there. And I don't believe that for a moment. I don't believe that about people based on their education. I don't believe that about people based on their gender. And I don't believe that about people based on their ethnicity. So why would I countenance a quota on anything? And I think I'm not dodging your question, because I think that would still be my answer, even if Parliament were as extreme as you have suggested. But given that it's not, the picture is a great deal better than your comparison.
So Morgan, then how do you handle those things of, right, well, we want somebody on, I don't know, a TV show, we want somebody from the ASI or a classical liberal perspective, but you're shunted to the front of the queue. I mean, do you think, well, it's not wholly fair, but, you know, hey, my career's advancing, or do you refuse to do it, or do you kick back? Well, how should we tackle that problem?
If it's a specific policy, and it tends to be one that one of my male colleagues is actually very well versed on, it's their main area of expertise, I will do my best to actually say, I really think you should give the credit where the credit's due. This is his policy, he's very good at it. If it's a general thing, you know, it is better to have someone who at least can share our point of view in the public sphere, and at least we get on. If the alternative is turning it down and they invite someone else on, we won't do that, but we do tend to try our best to give credit where credit's due. But it's not heard, it's not received that well. I mean, the media and consumers of media have decided that we want more women on the air, and, you know, at whatever cost.
Yeah. I wish they do a lot more around diversity of opinion than diversity of gender or skin colour or the rest. I mean, I'm quite sure if you look at the BBC and the people who work there, they'll be ticking things off about women and racial quotas, but I don't know how many people who work at the BBC were in favour of Brexit. I bet it's not 52%. How many are in favour of, I don't know, the reintroduction of capital punishment or something?
Nowhere near the national positions on the questions you were talking about, and Brexit was a true extreme. I don't think the BBC, for example, is particularly politically biased in favour of one party or another. I think it's a bit soft left, but it was very clearly biased on Brexit. But that's because many organisations in this country, not just that example, many organisations have the idea that diversity means people looking different but thinking the same. And that is that's a terrible way of getting towards a truly pluralistic society in which the most important, because you've levelled the playing field, because it doesn't matter whether you're black or white, because it doesn't matter whether you're a man or woman, the most important diversity is your diversity of opinion.
Okay, well, let's Morgan and Alex, you've put Westminster to rights. Okay, we've cracked that one in the first third of the show. Good on you. So now I want you to put local politics to rights. We've got local elections, not all over the country, but in large swathes of the country this week. What are the differences in local politics, would you say, Alex? I mean, it tends to elicit something of a yawn, doesn't it, amongst the turnout's pretty low. It's bins and potholes, that's what we're sort of typically talking about. You know, important on a day-to-day level, I guess, but hardly gets the blood racing. Do you think our local politics and the political culture around that is healthy, vibrant, diverse in the right way, or is this just a sort of bunch of pen-pushing, sort of unnecessary bureaucracy? Oh,
there's pen-pushing, unnecessary bureaucracy at every level of government, not just local or national, and in civil service, local and national, and that's hardly unique to the UK. But again, another unfashionable view for me. I think local government's really important. In fact, I'd like to make it more important. I'd like it to make more decisions. I'd like to devolve decision-making to the lowest possible body to which people can feel a true affinity. And I think, contrariwise, the further away power feels from you, the less connected you feel to the decision-making body making decisions over your life. And that's one of the many reasons that I was in favour of Brexit. And if you look at that telescope all the way from a supranational parliament, whether it makes decisions or not, in which you are a very small sliver, and your national view is never going to hold sway, all the way down to the local level, I prefer weighting power at the local level. And the difficulty with that is, in this country, we pay lip service to it, but we're unwilling to let people make the spending decisions that come with it, and I would.
Morgan, on the other side of the pond, you've got a much more sort of, federalised, localised structure. Okay, it's a much bigger country geographically. Here in the UK, I mean, how easy is it for an American to even get their head around it? Look, how much power is concentrated here in Westminster? I mean, I can't remember the numbers, but it's 95% of all major tax and spending decisions made here. Nearly all the rules made here. Quite often local councils are having to follow national diktats. Their ability to raise or cut taxes pretty limited. Extraordinarily centralised country we live in, isn't it?
It really is, and I think that is kind of one of the reasons why you probably don't get the turnout that you would like in the local elections if you want more decentralized societies, because at the end of the day, you've already elected the party in Westminster, so how much on the margins is really going to change? I mean, you might see your council tax go up or something like that, which is one of the big impacts that you kind of get at the local level, and how that money is spent, what prioritization they put into place. But in the States, people at the same time, aren't that engaged in their state level politics, even though it has a lot more of an impact. So I think local elections and state elections just kind of don't elicit the same, they don't have the same sexiness, I guess, as a national election does.
So both of you would like to see more local power and decision making, for better or worse. Some councils will make big bad errors, but
let a thousand flowers bloom.
Yeah, right.
Let people make more decisions. What we've done is pay lip service to that idea while starving local government of funds. It's perverse.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure that you hit the thumbs up, button. If you're not yet a subscriber to the IEA London YouTube channel, please hit that subscribe button just underneath the film here, and also the notification bell. That way you will be notified all of the IEA London's upcoming content. I wonder whether somebody might take a slightly more sceptical view of local government. So joining me as my third guest this evening is my very good friend, the Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance. Please welcome John O'Connell. John, thanks for joining us. Listen, I really wanted to have you on in local election week because you guys round the corner at the Taxpayers Alliance, you are the kind of scourge of local government. You are not just kind of campaigners for public awareness, but kind of investigative journalists almost when it comes to local government splurging and spaffing money up the wall, right? I mean, I've just got a couple of figures here. Across the UK, local authorities spent over £300,000 last year on celebrities turning on Christmas lights. Okay, £300,000, you save that, you're not going to sort out the national debt, but still quite a bit of money. Councils own about £2 billion worth of artwork. I'm not totally sure they should be. What are your great stories of local government's perverse, wasteful behaviour?
Wow, there's quite a lot to count, really. We looked recently at Slough Council, who had a very swanky refurbishment done on their head office, while at the same time their financial position is in the red to the tune of about 308 million, and their new offices now look like something that Google would work in. You know, there's Nottingham Council spending £7,000 on painting a zebra crossing in a rainbow flag. You know, and much more besides. Milton Keynes Council putting up moss all over the town and in their
putting up what?
To moss.
Right.
To
moss.
Yeah, moss.
Right.
As in to sort of burnish their green credentials.
Right.
I guess.
Right.
You know, Doncaster Council £7,000 on hold music for when you call up the council and it plays you Ness and Dormer.
They have their own unique hold music.
Well, they have Ness and Dormer,
My
only
God.
the best for Doncaster residents.
Well, they had to pay the rights,
Yeah,
the
licensing
IP
fees.
rights to play
Indeed.
Ness and Dormer.
Indeed.
Jeez.
So examples abound, but of course a lot of what councils do is restricted by statutory requirements anyway. A large part of their spending is on adult social care. So, you know, cracking that picture at a sort of national level will probably help to make councils more efficient in the long run. So their discretionary spending as a percentage of their overall budget is actually quite small, but the parts that they have discretion over are often wasted, unfortunately.
And Alex, do you think, I'm a great admirer of the TPA's work here. I mean, it's sort of, you never know when you see these reports come out from the TPA to sort of laugh or cry, because some of it is so preposterous, but it is actually a kind of, colossal waste of public funds. But are voters motivated by that? I mean, will people in Doncaster vote out the incumbents because they've wasted £7,000 on Ness and Dormer, or is it just sort of chit-chat?
They might in extremis if an example really catches their eye, and I welcome the work of the TPA because it's good for people to think to themselves, well, maybe we shouldn't spend this money because we might get embarrassed in way X. But of course, beneath the eye-catching examples, and the TPA does this work too, is the more systemic problem with these organisations, which is that there are basic things that they get wrong, and it's not just local government. For example, there are organisations in this country, in the private sector, that have 100,000 plus employees, 200,000, 500,000, and they do that with one HR office. We've got 43 police constabularies, 43 HR officers. Is that really necessary? We will have each of the HR departments be matched by a digital capability at local council level. I understand you might need someone to have the Twitter login and someone to run the website. Hopefully it's the same person. But you certainly don't need a fully fledged department, and so forth. Council deputy chief executives. Why? The problems aren't the eye-catching examples of splurging one every now and then.
It's the whole weight of bureaucracy.
It's the systemic weight of bureaucracy. And I can't help but feel if we stripped some of that out, we'd be more willing to give more money to these authorities to do what they really need to do, which is the kind of thing John was talking about.
There's two elements to that. One is that shared services has been trialled before successfully. I think it was Hammersmith and Fulham, Kensington and Chelsea, and
Tri-borough.
Yeah, the tri-borough work that they did, where they shared those back office functions and among the three of them and saved a shed load of money. I think that, some councils have moved to unitary status. So you'd have a county structure and then 6 or 7 districts underneath. Some have moved to unitary status and saved loads of money there. Wiltshire being an example where they've saved tens of millions of pounds from doing so. But I think when we're looking at these examples in the round, I think Alex mentioned it earlier that councils not having the necessary funds. I do think, in their defence, over the years of the coalition government, when we're talking about decentralisation, the decentralisation of spending reductions definitely happened. Whitehall didn't get a single penny taken off it, and local authorities did.
Yep.
So to their defence, they're working with smaller budgets than they otherwise would, because it was much easier politically for the government at the time to devolve all of that out to the councils, say, you naughty guys, you go and sort yourselves out. When actually a lot of the big items of waste happen over there. A small point to finish on, the smaller level waste, when people say, oh, what's £7,000? It's, 5 or 6 families' council tax bill for the year. That's what £7,000 is. So these items of waste do really matter. And also, when you talk to people outside of Westminster, do they know what the national debt is? Probably not.
Yeah.
And even if you told them, would they understand what that number is? Probably not, and nor should they.
Yeah.
But you know, when a council's wasted 300 grand, they think that's the value of my home.
Yeah.
How can they do that? You know, so it's much more on an understandable level for people.
Morgan, are non-federal elections in America, do they gear around tax more than they might here? I mean, I sometimes think in local elections campaigns, I've lived in a whole range of boroughs, it's all about service provision and all the wonderful things they've done. But, you know, it's not the only factor I'd vote on, but, you know, keeping my taxes low is pretty important to me, and it's clearly a big factor on how people vote in national elections, but maybe less so at the local level. What's it like in the States?
I think in the States, we're still working on a lot of those social battles. So that tends to be where people vote, especially at the state level, as we've seen recently with the leaked Roe v. Wade decision. That's going to be a huge battleground. So I think in the States, at the local level, state level, you tend to get more people voting along social and cultural levels, less on tax. But I think that's good, because in the UK, we've kind of solved those issues, so we can have maybe more mundane discussions about tax and, you know, bin collections and stuff. So it might seem more boring, but it's just safer ground, I suppose.
Alex, I know you've got to leave us shortly. I just want to finish with you. The problem is in these local election campaigns, I sort of want them to be mundane and boring. I want some local council to say, well, yeah, I'm afraid you're not going to get your litter collected quite as often, but I'll reduce your council tax by 15 quid or whatever it might be. But actually, they're kind of portrayed really as just a gigantic by-election. You know, send a message that you don't like the Prime Minister by voting one way or another in your local council. Or I think some Conservatives are saying, you know, please ignore what's going on in Westminster. But I mean, that's quite a fight, isn't it? You sort of use this as a sort of giant opinion poll rather than actually a celebration of municipal devolved democracy.
And you're right. And if we respected local government more, perhaps that would be treated differently. But it's undeniably a proxy for what's happening in Westminster on either side. And of course, the traditional battle is, you know, if you want to support the government or support the Prime Minister, you can send a message. So both sides tend to play at it. But I just wanted to pick up on one thing about that Roe against Wade leak that we've seen from the United States. It's another example to me. The worst, whatever you think about abortion and abortion rights, and I note that it's going to return, if followed through as a decision, it's going to return that power to the states, where you will then have local government really voting on that sort of thing. But the worst thing about that entire episode for me is that a system which is depended on trust in the most important way between clerks and judges who may have ferocious disagreements but keep them internal until that decision is published. Somebody has taken it upon him or herself to leak it, and it's a draft decision which may or may not make it to the end. And that is very bad, I think, for the nature of trust in the judiciary in the United States, and it's probably reflective of the way that we've lessened trust in institutions more generally.
Good note to leave us on, Alex. What a pleasure to have you. Thanks very much for being with us. As I mentioned earlier, if you're enjoying the show, please hit the like button, the thumbs up, hit the subscribe banner and the notification bell. That way you will be kept up to date with all of our content. And actually, just last week, a piece of content, if you haven't come across it yet, we'll give you a little promo clip from it now. I was able to sit down in this very room with Nigel Farage, former leader of UKIP and the Brexit Party, of course, now a national broadcaster, to hear his thoughts on deregulation after Brexit and what a disappointment it's been. Short clip coming up now. What swung me over to the Leave side was that the European Union became ever more statist and intrusive, that saw its aim not as breaking down barriers, but determining the exact nature of a health warning on a cigarette packet in all 27 provinces, the exact maximum suction power of a vacuum cleaner, you know, exactly how a light bulb should be. This is madness. And I thought that take back control meant, and for years, I mean, some of them were a bit fun, pointing at, you know, bendy banana regulations, but for years, the Eurosceptic campaign was, here are a load of nonsensical rules, which are at best irritating and at worst holding back businesses. Let's take back control, get rid of them, have a regulatory framework that's good for them. Whereas we've kept the whole bloody lot, from what I can see.
Pretty much, and that's what needs to be done. That is what needs to be done. It is that stuff in terms of environmental law, employment law, health and safety at work. Where it's excessive, it needs to be reduced, it needs to be, I mean, even simplified would help. And this government have not grasped it, and I keep asking this question of senior Conservatives, at least the ones that will speak to me. I'm told we've been too busy with the pandemic. You know, we haven't had time to address this stuff, and they've got to get a grip on this pretty damn quickly. They've got, you know, they've been in power for a long time. The economics are moving against them. If they're not able to mobilise entrepreneurial Britain to go out and vote for them en masse at the next election, they're pretty much doomed. Because you think about it, you've got somewhere between 5.5 and 6 million people who are self-employed, you know, company directors, sole traders. You add to that their extended families. You know, you're looking at a very, very big percentage of the UK voting population is connected to small and medium, genuinely small and medium-sized enterprises. And unless the Conservatives can get an overwhelming vote from them, they've got no chance next time round.
So that was just a short clip of my half-hour long or so interview with Nigel Farage. We covered a whole range of topics. If you'd like to watch the whole video, we'll put a link in the show notes below and in the live chat. But moving on with this evening's show, great to welcome from the home team our head of lifestyle economics, scourge of dodgy statistics and the Nanny State. Please give a very, very warm welcome to Chris Snowdon. Hi, Chris. Right. So as you can see, we're all a bit I'm more stacked than the rest of you, but I want to start by talking about alcohol and the Nanny State. Chris, you have recently released an IEA report entitled The Hangover, the Cost of a Minimum Alcohol Pricing in Scotland, and we'll put a link to Chris's report in the live chat and in the show notes below. Scotland brought in a minimum alcohol price. You're saying the policy has cost the Scottish people a total of 270 million quid. That amounts to a bit over £59 per person, or £71 per drinker. Tell us a bit more about your report, what you discovered. Have you proved that the SNP got this wrong?
I wouldn't say we proved it, no, but we wanted to look at an element of the policy that's not being evaluated by Public Health Scotland. To be fair, Public Health Scotland are doing a pretty good evaluation of this, actually. Most of their research, and there's been quite a lot of it, has been pretty thorough. And also, to be fair to the SNP, there's a 5-year sunset clause on this. We're into the 5th year now, so in theory it could be dropped next May if it's shown not to work. Now, I suspect that there will be enough kind of plausible deniability for them to say, well, we think it has worked because consumption's gone down or something's gone down. We couldn't find any evidence of it. Actually, when you look at the models, I don't know if you know, but the whole policy was almost entirely based on computer models from people in public health. I think from the last 2 years, most people have realised that public health models are not always that. Not always bang on accurate. Don't always predict, you know, human behaviour changing things. But even if you look at what they were projecting, which is supposed to be impressive, actually, it's so small. You know, the decline in things like workplace absences or unemployment, it's so small that you can't really see it in the overall data. But we in the report, we show the overall data for things like those two indicators, alcohol-related hospitalisations, alcohol-related mortality, which is currently at a 12-year high, I think, in Scotland, although, to be fair, the COVID pandemic has had a big effect on that. Cut a long story short, we can't really see any clear evidence at all of any kind of step change in terms of, you know, workplace absences and their health. What we do look at, which I don't think the Public Health Scotland evaluation is looking at, is just how much it costs people. It was projected to cost the average Scottish drinker £5 a year. We think it's not far off £20 a year. So as you say, £71
since it was brought in.
270. Yeah, it's depends how you look at it, isn't it? You can say it's a trivial amount of money. I would say it's not if you're on low income.
But help me with this, Chris, because obviously, I mean, I shared those statistics. Total cost of 270 million quid. You reckon that over the years has therefore been a bit over 70 quid per drinker. You're right, not a game-changing amount of money, but for people on tight margins, you know, they'd rather have 70 quid than not have it, I guess. But obviously, the entire purpose of this, and theory would suggest, if you get the prices up, consumption goes down, right? So how do you think you've stumbled across the situation in which this is costing more, but consumption isn't falling? I mean, is alcohol so inelastic?
No, consumption has fallen. consumption has fallen, we reckon, by about 3 or 4%, which, funnily enough, is more or less what the model predicted.
Right.
Model predicted.
So it was a computer model that works, run by the experts.
They were right on the consumption. They were also right when they projected the outcome of Scotland's previous ban some years ago, where they banned buy one get one free on alcohol. They correctly projected how much consumption would fall by. They didn't correctly project any of the health outcomes, because actually when these policies come in, these policies on pricing basically come in, insofar as they have an effect at all, they have an effect on moderate drinkers. They don't have effect on street drinkers, independent drinkers, or even binge drinkers.
Yeah, right? Or presenters of YouTube
shows. So that's the whole problem with the theory. The theory is based on this idea that if you can just bring per capita alcohol consumption down, you will automatically reduce all the problems associated with alcohol. Yeah. And it's not true. There's never been any evidence it's true. A classic example of this, I think in the future it will be seen as a classic example of this, is lockdown. Okay, so you had this huge reduction in alcohol advertising because it wasn't worth advertising a lot of alcohol because all the pubs and clubs were shut. You had this huge reduction in alcohol availability because all the pubs and clubs and restaurants were shut. And sure enough, you did see this small reduction in alcohol consumption in 2020. We've got a new paper coming out about this in a few months' time, actually. But you saw this enormous increase in alcohol-related deaths, 15-20%. And it wasn't much different in Scotland than it was in England.
So it's essentially the public policy is focused more at the far end of the tail, basically.
Exactly right.
Where you're sort of squeezing people in the middle who don't have a drink problem, but it's actually a small, minority who have a severe problem, and it's not a targeted enough approach at them.
That is exactly it. So the standard public health idea and dogma is that you need to treat the entire population as if they are problematic. If you can reduce their consumption overall, then you're bound to see the gains. And you don't do that because you're essentially ignoring the people who are, like you say, at the tail of the distribution. Very, very heavy drinkers. They're not affected by advertising. They're not affected by pricing. They're affected by things like being able to see somebody face to face for some rehab, which they couldn't do in the lockdown.
Sure. John, let me come to you. You guys at the Taxpayers Alliance, point out the colossal impact that taxation has on the cost of living. We're talking about a cost of living crisis seems to almost be entirely focused on sort of food and energy. Mm-hmm. I'm not poo-pooing that, but obviously your tax bill is pretty much the biggest thing that most households face. But do you think that cost of living now being such an issue, not that I welcome that, I'd like the cost of living to fall rather than go up, but might it be able to get us off this Nanny State bandwagon, that things are, putting up beer by a few pence, or I think buy one, get one free deals on junk food are going to be banned from October this year. Well, you've got a cost of living crisis, the last thing you want to start doing is banning buy one, get one free, right? I mean, and the government's impact assessment predicts that will reduce food intake by just 3 calories a day. Do you think people might now focus a bit less on their waistline or their liver and a bit more on price and cost? And might that actually be how we start to unravel the nanny state?
In an ideal world, yeah, of course, but we don't live in an ideal world, and I think Chris used the word dogma in some of his remarks, and I think that quite often some people who work in the public health industry at large are quite zealous about all this, and maybe their big concern isn't necessarily the tail end of the distribution, it's actually just they don't like the culture of drinking, or British culture more generally, or whatever it is. I think that there's quite a sort of dogmatic element to this, such that even in this situation where cost of living is where it is and inflation's nearing double digits, etc., they will still push for this stuff. I suppose it's incumbent on people like us to push back against it, but perhaps they'll reverse the ban that's coming up on 2 for 1 and 3 for 2 deals and all of this kind of thing. If they're not going to do it now, then they probably never will they?
Morgan, what's the Adam Smith Institute's solution to the cost of living crisis?
Well, it's certainly not making...
Buy one, get 10 free.
It's certainly not making food more expensive. And you think it's absolutely mad that the government would think of implementing a policy that does exactly that. I mean, the optics alone, you are making it harder to buy food when people are already struggling. And so I think that's just one thing that, as you say, if this doesn't cause people to realize this is actually what the impact of that policy is. And to save 3 calories a day, this was similar gains that they said were going to be had by banning advertising of high-fat, salt, sugar foods. 3 calories a day is like half a Smartie. This is not adding up to anything of value, even over the lifetime of a consumer. So you're creating these policies that have no measurable impact and demonstrable harm by making it harder to obtain things that you want, things that you need in terms of food. I mean, one of the proposals was ready meals, making microwave or oven meals more expensive because they tend to be less healthy than a freshly cooked meal. Fine, probably they are. But they're also the only option for a lot of people. You know, students who can't fill a full fridge because they share with 3 other people, mothers who work 2 jobs and have to put food on the table. That's what you're doing when you're saying, we think that 3 calories a day per person is more important than the ability to feed your children.
Mark, just one final point on that. I think quite often there's quite an anti-progress element to this, right? Eco-campaigners don't like cheap flights. You know, public health campaigners don't like cheap food. You know, all of these things that we're able to do for less money now, which is fantastic and a sign of human progress, they're against. And it's always people on lower incomes that get hurt at the whims of some fads of the middle class.
Chris, we always have you on this programme, not just because you're a very good friend and a fantastic IEA colleague, but because you're our token miserable git who continually says we're all going to hell in a handcart. Things are not just really bad, but and you keep being right, and things are going to get worse. Come on, is there anything in my slight theory of optimism here that the cost of living issue will actually move some of the arguments in your more libertarian direction? Not because of necessarily the great studies that you've done around trade-offs between health benefits and price, just simply because it will be an overarching priority to get the cost of living down, and therefore things that are expensive to ordinary families that save you half a smartie a day, I think Morgan was saying, are just not going to wash, they're not going to fly.
You would think so. I mean, John's quite right. If you're not going to do it now, if you're not going to ditch this now, you never will. I don't think they'll ditch it all the same. I still don't think they'll ditch it. And I don't think Boris Johnson even believes in it. I think this is something he was pushed into. You know, he went into intensive care with COVID and he was convinced it was because he was fat, and so he just delivered all this stuff. But Boris Johnson's...
But he can't be convinced that if he ate less 3 calories fewer a day, that would have made...
He wouldn't have been bothered about that. I mean, let's be honest, part of it was distracting the attention from the fact that the government wasn't handling COVID particularly well at the time. I don't think they'll do it. They won't do it. They won't like the backlash. The SNP certainly aren't going to drop minimum pricing, regardless of how much evidence shows it doesn't work. And their own evaluation is currently showing it doesn't make any real difference. So no, I mean, I'm absolutely pessimistic about it. I think quite the reverse. I think what's going to happen is the government's going to keep printing more money to give people bailouts. People can use the term cost of living crisis. Let's call it what it is. It's high inflation, right? High inflation. Do you print more money and distribute it when you've got high inflation? No, you don't. You shouldn't do anyway. I suspect that's what we're doing. In fact, it is what we're doing.
So, John, coming back to you, I said the World Health Organization yesterday told us that they believe that food apps on your phone and online gaming, I have no idea what a food app is. I do know what online gaming is. I spend far too much time on that. Those are driving up obesity levels. I mean, there seems to be no bloody end to this, right? What are we going to do? Stop people playing, you know, Angry Birds on their phone or something? You know, or there's going to be a regulation saying that every 10 minutes your phone needs to scream at you to go out for a walk or lift some weights or something. It just seems to be a continual torrent of these sort of interventionist measures.
Yeah, and it never stops, and you know they'll be implemented at some point in the future, and then they'll find something else to be sort of puritanical and judgmental about. I sort of agree with Chris in a very practical way. I'm sort of pessimistic about the future on a lot of this stuff, but then again, it's our job, as I often say, to be naively optimistic about these things. If we don't think we can change anything, why bother? So we need to carry on doing what we're doing to try and push back against this. I mean, these people are obviously very well heeled, public sector money, all that kind of stuff, so we just need to do what we can and stay naively optimistic and push back against people like Chris who are grumpy about it.
Morgan, why don't you think the kind of broad live and let live philosophy of life, you know, accepting that, you know, too much alcohol is bad for you, too much fatty food's bad for you, too many cigarettes bad for you, probably any number of cigarettes are bad for you. Why isn't live and let live just the doctrine of our age? Why is it endless studies into, you know, whether something needs to be done about online gaming? How do we get back to a live and let live view of the world?
It's because most people like to see their government doing something. whether or not it's helpful, whether or not it's useful, whether or not it's based in any evidence. And that this government in particular, I think, is a government that needs to be seen to be doing something, no matter what it is, so that they do it on, drink and food, and they also do it on the online safety bill, and like putting their fingers into every aspect of society because they think it will get them an extra percentage point at the polls. People like to see their government doing things. We probably don't. A lot of us would rather they didn't, but most of the electorate likes to see the government being active. And
do you think that's
looking to
right, or
solve
do you think
problems.
politicians just feel they have to do things?
I think it's a bit of
just
both.
No politician just sort of says, yeah, it might be a problem, but don't think there's much I can do about it, to be honest. You don't really hear those sort of responses very often on BBC Newsnight, do you?
Well, it doesn't instill a lot of confidence, does it?
Well, it would in me. I'm
of
an
course.
honest person. There's a problem that you can't fix.
Yeah, but the electorate don't want to believe that. They want to believe that everything can be fixed, and I think they.
God, you're even more miserable than Snowdon. I mean, what? We're doomed to defeat then forevermore.
She's quite right. You know, the politicians haven't really got the big answers to the big questions, and so they focus on the minutiae. And they also, in many cases, stand to benefit personally from introducing this stuff. The Minister for Public Health, for example, the position didn't exist until 1998, I think, right? Every Minister for Public Health has been a grandstander ever since. They've always adopted whatever the public health people tell them to do. They get immediately encircled by a swarm of public health people saying, bring in plain packaging, bring them in whatever it might be. They can't resist it. They can't resist it because it gets a name in the papers. Because although it's relatively trivial in the grand scheme of the absolute catastrophe that we find ourselves in, it gets people ringing in on the phone in shows. It's worth putting on the front pages. So these awful people, they get quite a bit of attention out of doing it, and also they get this sense of satisfaction. The idea that they're saving tens of thousands of lives. They're not saving any lives at all, but they're told by the public health people that they are.
And didn't the 2015 Conservative Manifesto open with the words, we have a plan for every stage of your life? Rather you didn't, thanks very much.
That was exactly. I mean, they were absolutely on the front page, central planning. Although I can remember their 2010 manifesto, and I got sight of it just about an hour before it was released. I can't remember how. But it was called An Invitation to Join the Government of Britain. So I emailed them back and said, thanks, I'll be Sports Minister. I didn't realise, I mean, who wants to join I want the Government of Britain off my back, I don't want to join it. So Morgan, what's your strategy at the ASI? What should other classical Liberals do? Is it just slow and steady win the race, just keep putting forward the arguments patiently and calmly, and have a little bit of O'Connell optimism thrown in to, thwart the misery guts of Snowdon? Is that our only real hope of ever turning this round?
I think it is. We try to point out the evidence base or lack thereof around these policies, as Chris is so good at doing, pointing out that these are flawed assumptions that policies being made on, and people should deserve better. You should have policies that are grounded in reality and fact.
I've been doing that for 15 years. It's made no difference whatsoever.
Well, we can keep trying.
It's just something to talk about.
I'm with John. You have to keep trying.
You have to keep trying. Morgan, it's been lovely having you with us. Thanks very much. John and Chris, stay with us. Our next topic's another issue related to taxation. Windfall taxes. Politicians are pushing for a windfall tax on energy companies. Sir Keir Starmer, leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition, has called for a windfall tax on oil and gas companies in the North Sea. This seems to be a result of BP reporting an underlying profit of 6.2 billion, I don't know if it's pounds or US dollars, compared to 2.6 billion for the same period of last year. So more than doubled their profit margin. John, what are we to make of this? This seems another populist cry, there's a cost of living crisis going on, but energy prices are too high, and look, the energy companies are making profits that we consider too big, so let's seize some of that. I genuinely don't know what the Labour Party's policy is to do with the money they seize, presumably, reduce tax on energy bills or improve welfare payments, but this is getting some real traction now, isn't it? Let's tax supernormal, or what we consider to be abnormal profits, harder and higher.
Yeah, and the Conservative response has been sort of mixed in the sense that the Prime Minister said it wasn't going to happen, but then other ministers are saying, we'll keep it under review, because they don't want to be seen to be saying no, essentially, when they should be saying no, because it's a bad idea. The same argument was used in supermarkets during COVID. Who is to decide what supernormal profits are? Is quite a dangerous road to go down. And the Labour proposals, I think, would apparently raise 1.2 billion, which redistributed across all 26 million households is probably about 40 odd quid. So it's not really going to help with the rising energy bills in the way that they say it is. And then
We're going to help people afford, buy a bit more drink in Scotland.
Swings and roundabouts. But the message that you send, not just to the oil and gas sector or energy sector or supermarket sector, but to any sector whatsoever, is if we decide that you're doing too well, we'll come back after you. So why would a company that's looking for a potential country in which to invest choose the UK? They wouldn't bother.
Chris, is this the new target? Not so much the, sins and, naughty things like smoking and drinking and, and eating food and things like that the Puritans disapprove of. Is profit really going to be where the government, the state moves to next? Your profits are too high, we have determined, and therefore we're going to take a bigger slice of that than we have previously done.
Well, it's a bit of both, actually, because, of course, oil is very sinful these days, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And there's a big push for having a tobacco industry windfall tax, which couldn't work for various reasons, I don't think. It would affect, at best, it would turn into an extra excise tax, as if smokers aren't already taxed enough. It's a combination of both things. You get an industry people don't like, and you see them making money, and you decide to put a tax on them. And I like, as with most things, I look at this largely from consequentialist grounds. I have no particular, well, I am actually a shareholder in Shell, but aside from that, I have no particular...
Declare your interest, sir. Declare your interest. Yep.
I have no particular love for the oil industry, and they are making a lot of money at the moment. But BP have just written off $20 billion because they've had to essentially just forget about their one of the companies they bought in Russia. 2 years ago, they were making nothing. They were making huge losses. Are these people who are calling for windfall taxes saying we should have subsidised them in 2020 when the barrel was worth more than the oil in it, I recall? Yeah. Right, so this is a pretty, there's a lot of fluctuations in the market, put it that way. At the moment it's doing well, it'll probably do well for months to come, largely thanks to the sanctions on Russia. But the evidence, I think, does show that you bring windfall taxes in on pretty much anything, you reduce investment, and ultimately you reduce tax take.
This is what we would see.
Had that effect.
I hold no flag for BP or Shell. I haven't got shares in either of them.
Shell's good.
But I understand, John, BP's announced on Tuesday plans to invest $18 billion in green and fossil fuel innovations. Shell said to be investing $25 billion over the next decade, both sterling amounts there, I should say. The windfall tax would presumably, we'll roll back our investment plans then. But I guess my question to you, and every time Chris is here, he gets me more and more miserable and pessimistic, is why hasn't there been a fight back about this? Why haven't people said, well, if you do that, we're not going to be able to invest in these new innovations or technologies or creating new jobs or better infrastructure? The companies themselves seem to be incredibly quiet, and those on the end of the political spectrum that you would think would be, pro-enterprise and, allowing business to make profits and see making a profit not necessarily as a bad thing, but as a sign of success. I mean, they're absent from the stage, apart from think tankers like you and I, aren't they?
They've not just been quiet, they've said the opposite. One of the BP bigwigs was on the radio or the TV this morning saying a windfall tax wouldn't affect the 18 billion worth of decision-making, of investment decisions that they've made.
Is this the same guy who said his company was a cash machine a few months ago and really helped things?
Yeah. So they're not just staying quiet, they're making the case for the opposition almost.
Berners-Looney, his name, isn't it?
I think so.
A wonderful name.
Yeah, that's the reason, isn't it?
It's madness. Why are they behaving like that?
It's a loony.
PR. It's good PR, I suppose. Well, in their mind, it's good PR. But what the basic, and obviously, lots of the media then jumped on this and said, a real sort of, it's killed the government's argument stone dead about no windfall taxes and stuff. It didn't at all. If you tax a company more, it has less money to invest. That's just a fact. You can like it or not, but it's just true. And one of the biggest problems we have is productivity. How do you boost productivity? More investment into R&D and things like that. So having some backbone to not even just defend your own company, but to defend the entire system on which has grown our economy and seen, boundless prosperity, it's quite staggering, really.
And Chris, going back to you then, so you think this is just the next sin tax? Because I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm guessing if, is it sin because, oil is seen as a bad thing? I'm guessing if 5 or 6 or 7 years ago you decided as a start-up entrepreneur, you know what? I think I'm going to go into the face mask business. Well, I presume you had a pretty good last couple of years, right? You must have sold a lot more than you were 6 or 7 years ago, and presumably selling many fewer face masks now. So is it that profit's a sin, or is it that energy's a sin, or is it, from the point of view of an interventionist politician, the absolute sweet spot? Both of them are sinful, so let's go for them. And in their extreme unwisdom, the companies themselves will say, yeah, it's a fair cop.
Yeah, well, I think the latter, and I think the chairman of BP has been unbelievably bad at doing his job in the last few months. He seems to have it on some sort of Harry-Carry mission. I think part of the problem is, the basic problem is that people are paying a lot more for their energy, and you see energy companies making a lot of profits. So it's not, you don't need to be a raving communist to think when we can tax these companies more. Now, firstly, they already get taxed more than other companies. So the corporation tax from oil fields is 30% as opposed to 19%.
There's a 40% special corporation tax on the North Sea.
It's 40%.
40%.
Yeah,
It's 30 and then a 10% supplement, yeah.
Okay, so 40%.
Well, 30 and a 10% supplement's 40.
Yeah,
I'm not
So they pay
top
twice as much.
mathematician, but
It changes a lot. It's changed a lot in the last 40 years. And always when it goes up, it's tended to result in less investment. And people go, well, what's investment mean? Because people just think, well, we've got the North Sea, there's all that oil and gas over there, and these guys have effectively got a license to get it out. And it's a license to print money. It's a cash machine, like Bernard Looney said. Well, it's not quite as simple as that, because you need to keep finding new oil places to put oil drills and gas. And various other ones need decommissioning, and so the government pays them back for that. But it requires a certain amount of entrepreneurialism. And
investment and money.
Yes, absolutely. And if you dissuade these companies by putting in arbitrary and capricious windfall taxes out of the blue, they'll just go, well, we don't bother with the North Sea. We're a global company. We'll go somewhere else. We'll go to Brazil. We can go anywhere. Okay, and this is what has happened over the course of the last 40 years. When you've taxed these companies more, they said, well, we won't bother with the North Sea. We won't bother with the UK because it's too risky, because we don't know what they're going to do next. This applies to any arbitrary and capricious tax you place on anything, including on wealth. You'll just get rid of the people who are bringing in the money.
John, what do you think folks of our view of the world who want small, limited government and voluntary exchange, and to allow the individual choices of individual men and women to be what dictates the lives that they lead, not the diktats of bureaucrats and politicians? What do we need to do to get some big guns to join this crusade? It's quite a lonely battle, isn't it? I mean, there's you guys around the corner, us here, the Adam Smith Institute, a handful of others who are on this side of the ledger. But you would have thought that the forces of pro-market capitalism would be the main artillery, and we'd just be a couple of snipers on the sidelines. But it literally seems down to us to make this case. Have you got any idea about how we might actually encourage business to speak up for business?
No, I wish I had a good idea for that. They're sort of, unfortunately not very good at making the case for themselves in any sector whatsoever. They always have to, they seemingly apologise for the very activity that they carry out, and they have to have this sort of larger purpose rather than providing goods and services at a reasonable price to consumers. I wish they spoke out more in defence of themselves, but...
Shareholder activism? I mean, if you're a shareholder, I mean, Chris has already declared his interest. Presumably you want your Shell shares to go up rather than down. Are you applying any pressure at the Shell AGM to make sure that's the strategy of the board?
No, I've yet to turn up at the AGM.
Well, you're part of the bloody problem then, Chris.
Fair enough.
Invitation to join the board of Shell.
Yeah. I mean, do you think we need a bit more shareholor activism? That's a kind of principal agent problem now.
I mean, in an ideal world, that would be good. But it is a lonely sort of little battle that we have. But one that, again, I'm naively optimistic, but I think these things move in cycles, and we will see our sort of day again when people realise we've gone too far down the rabbit hole
And
the
let's
other way.
face it,
Actually,
you know,
it's not working.
this hasn't actually happened yet, right? This windfall tax hasn't happened.
But as it's 40%. I've given you the bloody numbers already here. They just wanted to go higher.
Okay, there's always been a windfall tax in that case, but this new windfall tax hasn't happened. I don't think probably it will. So maybe these guys are playing it smart. Maybe they're saying things behind closed doors to politicians and making their case that way, and then going on the radio going like, "Yeah, we hate making oil. We're just going to turn into a solar power company in 50 years' time."
Yeah, but you know, if the Prime Minister said it wasn't going to happen, it probably has killed it off. But the narrative holding in the media is still quite dangerous for causes like ours that believe in this stuff, whether they are saying that kind of stuff
So now
behind
you're
closed
being a
doors.
pessimist.
Yeah, we've got to mix it up now, haven't we? Yeah, keep people guessing. Yeah.
Everybody becomes a pessimist when they sit down next to you for half an hour, Chris. Bloody hell.
Optimist now.
Have you got any strategic advice? What do we need to do to, find where people who you would think would be, broadly speaking, our natural allies? They might not take exactly the same philosophical kind of ideological approach that some of us take, but on a practical level, you would have thought that they would like some of the stuff we're saying. How on earth do we engage them and get them to make the case for free markets rather than appearing on radio sort of saying, yeah, I don't really mind if you tax me or not?
Just more YouTube videos.
More YouTube videos.
Lots more. YouTube videos, podcasts, and reports.
Right, there you go. There's a sign of optimism that what we're doing might eventually lead to something approaching, well, if not a victory, a less devastating defeat than those that Chris has been used to. John, Chris, been absolutely great having you with us. Thank you very much to my previous guests, Alex and Morgan, as well. If you'd like to help us make more YouTube videos so we really do finally start to win the battle of ideas, please do consider becoming an IA Online patron. That helps us keep the lights on here and pushing out more video content. Even if you haven't got a few pennies to spare, please make sure that you subscribe. We're on the march to 15,000 subscribers now, and hit that notification bell. And if you've enjoyed this evening's discussion, please make sure you hit that thumbs up like button. My thanks again to all of my guests. Huge thanks to our top IA Online patrons: Donald Blaney, James Burns, Jordan Grover, Mark Edwards, Philip Ozuv, Richard Leader, Robert Appleby and Timothy Worrell, and all of those who support us at the lower tiers as well. I'm delighted to announce we'll be welcoming some of our patrons into the studio audience for the next episode of Live with Littlewood, so if you want a chance to actually join us here in our Westminster studios, please do consider signing up. Go to patreon.com/IEA London or email lwl@iea.org.uk, and we'll put that information in the show notes below and in the chat. Thanks everyone, thanks for joining us. We'll be back again in 2 weeks' time. Stay safe, stay free. Over and out.